The morning was cold and grey at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It was the spring of 1948. A small group of Army engineers stood behind a low earthen wall, collars turned up against the wind. In front of them sat the largest gun ever bolted onto an American tank. It was a monster, a steel giant that weighed more than 70 tons. The cannon in its turret measured 6 inches across the mouth. That is wider than a dinner plate. When the crew fired it for the first time, the blast rolled across the flat Maryland fields like summer thunder. The shock waves slapped the air. Men felt it deep in their chests. The great machine rocked back on its tracks, then settled into the mud. The engineers were pleased. The gun worked. The tank worked. Everything they had promised on paper, they had now delivered in steel. And it meant almost nothing, because the enemy this tank was built to destroy no longer existed. Germany had surrendered 3 years earlier. Japan had surrendered too. The war was over. The German Tigers and King Tigers this steel giant was designed to hunt had already been cut up for scrap or towed away to gather dust in museums. This is the story of the heavy tank T30. It was the biggest gun America ever mounted on a tank. It was a triumph of engineering and ambition. And it is the story of how the mightiest tank gun of its age arrived just a little too late to fire a single shot in anger. To understand why America built such a beast, we have to go back to the summer of 1944. We have to go back to the hedgerows of Normandy. American soldiers had come ashore in France full of confidence. They believed they had the best equipment in the world. Man for man, they thought they were better than the enemy they faced. Then they met the German tanks, and the confidence began to crack. The workhorse of the American army was the M4 Sherman. It was reliable. It was fast. It was built by the tens of thousands. Between 1942 and the end of the war, American factories turned out nearly 50,000 of them. In sheer numbers, it was a marvel of mass production. But numbers were not the problem in Normandy. Quality was. The Sherman carried a short, low-velocity 75mm gun. Against the older German tanks, it did the job. Against the newest German armour, it did not. The Germans now fielded the Panther and the Tiger. These were bigger, tougher, and hit far harder. Their thick front armour was sloped to bounce shells away. American tank crews learned a bitter lesson in the fields of France. They would fire at a Tiger from the front. They would watch their shells strike the armour, and they would watch those shells bounce off and spin away into the sky. A single Tiger, dug in and waiting, could hold off 10 Shermans. The men who survived these fights came to respect the fighting power of the German machines, and to fear them. Picture the scene for a moment. A hot afternoon in the Normandy countryside. Narrow lanes hemmed in by tall hedges. An American tank crew edges their Sherman forward, hearts pounding, eyes straining. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the green, sits a German Tiger. It has already been waiting for an hour. It knows the range of every gap in the hedge. The American commander spots it first. He shouts the order to fire. The gun cracks. The shell flies true. It strikes the Tiger's front plate dead center. And nothing happens. The shell simply glances away. Now it is the Tiger's turn to fire, and the Americans know it. This was the nightmare that repeated itself across France that summer. Brave, well-trained men, in a good tank, discovering that good was not good enough. The men adapted the only way they could. They learned to work in teams. One group of Shermans would draw the enemy's attention from the front. Another group would swing wide and strike from the side or the rear, where the German armour was thinner. It worked, but it was slow, dangerous, and costly. In one stretch of heavy fighting, a single American tank battalion lost most of its tanks and half its men in just over 2 weeks. They won their battles in the end. The price was paid in machines and in lives, and the men never forgot it. The Americans tried an upgrade. They fitted some Shermans with a longer, harder-hitting 76mm gun. Everyone
If you're a fan of military technology and World War II history, please consider subscribing to our channel. It would help us tremendously. Thank you.
hoped it would fix the problem. It did not. General Omar Bradley remembered General Eisenhower's frustration when he learned the truth. The ordnance men had promised the new gun could handle anything the Germans had. Now, Eisenhower complained, he found he could not knock out a thing with it. That was the mood in the summer of 1944. Shock, anger, and a scramble to catch up. For years, the American army had told itself a comfortable story. It had watched its tanks win in North Africa. It had decided that heavy tanks were not really needed. The medium Sherman, built in huge numbers, would win the war by weight of production. Heavy tank projects were left to gather dust. There was another reason for the neglect. America had already tried to build a heavy tank earlier in the war. It was called the M6. It was big and slow and full of problems, and it never went anywhere useful. That failure left a sour taste. It made army planners cautious. Why pour effort into another giant, they asked, when the Sherman was rolling off the lines by the thousand and winning battles? So heavy tank work slowed almost to a stop. Normandy shattered that story. The Germans had heavy tanks, and they were a very tough nut to crack. So in late July of 1944, the American Ordnance Department threw the doors open. New heavy tank designs were pushed forward at top speed. The army wanted a machine that could go toe-to-toe with the biggest tanks Germany had and win. On the 14th of August, 1944, the army approved a brand new heavy tank. They called it the T-29. Its chassis borrowed ideas from the coming M26 Pershing. Its turret was huge. Its gun was a powerful 105mm cannon. On paper, it was exactly what the men in Normandy were begging for. But almost at once, the engineers began to worry. The main enemy of this new tank would be the King Tiger. That was the heaviest German tank of the war. Its front plate was a slab of steel, 150mm thick, sloped back at a brutal angle. The engineers ran the numbers and did not like what they saw. They feared the 105mm gun might not punch through that front plate at long range. So on that very same day, the 14th of August, they announced a backup plan. If the 105 would not do the job, they would build a tank around something bigger, much bigger. That backup plan was the heavy tank T30. The idea was simple and a little mad. Take the same giant hull and turret as the T-29. Then, instead of a tank gun, drop in a piece of field artillery. The weapon they chose as their starting point was the 155mm gun known as the Long Tom. This was one of the finest heavy artillery pieces of the war. American gunners used it across North Africa and Europe to smash targets from miles away. Few battles were fought without it. Now the plan was to shrink that artillery piece down and cram it into a turret. The tank version was given the name T7. To make it fit, engineers cut the barrel shorter. That lowered the speed of the shell a little, but the punch was still enormous. When it was finished, it was quite simply the most powerful tank gun anyone had ever built in metal. Work on the T30 officially began on the 14th of September, 1944. The plan called for 2 prototypes. The army never meant to build them in bulk. This tank was the insurance policy. Its real job was to prove that a gun this big could be made to work inside a tank at all. So what was it like, this steel giant? Start with the size. The T30 was close to 38 feet long. It stood more than 10 feet tall, taller than most rooms in your house. Loaded for battle, it weighed nearly 145,000 pounds. That is more than 70 tons. It was so heavy that ordinary bridges could collapse under it. Its front armor was a thick, sloped plate designed to shrug off the German guns that had tormented the Shermans in Normandy. Around the gun mount, the steel was almost 11 inches thick. Then there was the gun itself, 6 inches across. It fired a shell that weighed around 95 pounds. Picture lifting a heavy sack of cement and shoving it into a cannon. Then picture doing that again and again while under fire. The high explosive shell it fired was so powerful it could flatten a concrete bunker or blow the front off a building. Against a German fortress line, it would have been devastating. This mattered a great deal because the army had a second target in mind. Along Germany's western border stood a belt of concrete defences known as the West Wall or the Siegfried Line. It was a maze of bunkers, gun nests, and dragon's teeth, all built to stop an advancing army cold.
If you're a fan of military technology and World War II history, please consider subscribing to our channel. It would help us tremendously. Thank you.
American commanders knew they would have to smash through it to reach the heart of Germany. A tank that could roll up to a bunker and blow it apart with a single shell would be worth its weight in gold. The T30 was meant to be exactly that, a fortress breaker as well as a tank killer. Two terrible jobs wrapped in one enormous machine. The tank needed a crew of 6 to run it. There was a commander in the turret. There was a driver up front. There was a bow gunner beside him, working a machine gun. There was a gunner who aimed the great cannon. And then, unusually, there were 2 loaders. Most tanks needed only 1 loader. The T30 needed 2, and here is why. The shells were too big and too heavy for one man to handle. The gun used what is called separated ammunition. That means the shell and its gunpowder charge came in 2 separate pieces. One loader wrestled the heavy shell into place. The other handled the powder charge behind it. Together, the 2 pieces weighed around 135 pounds for every single shot. Even 2 strong men could not manage that by muscle alone. So the engineers added a spring-loaded rammer. This was a mechanical arm that helped shove the shell down the barrel and into the breech. Without it, the crew simply could not have loaded the gun fast enough to matter. And this is where the dream ran into hard reality. The gun was magnificent, but it was also a beast to feed. First, the rate of fire was slow. A good Sherman crew could fire many rounds a minute. The T30, loading by hand, could manage only about 2 shots a minute. In a fast tank duel, that is painfully slow. Second, there was the problem of ammunition. The shells were so large that the tank could only carry about 34 of them. A normal Sherman carried many more. In a long fight, the T30 could run dry. Third, and worst of all, was the loading angle. The gun and its shells were so heavy that the crew could only load the cannon when the barrel was held at certain angles. If the gun was pointed too high or too low, the loaders could not get the next shell in. That meant that after firing, the crew sometimes had to swing the barrel back to a loading position, reload, and then aim all over again. In the time it took to do all that, a faster enemy tank could fire several shots. So the T30 was a strange kind of weapon. It hit like a sledgehammer, but it swung slowly. It was a boxer with a knockout punch and heavy feet. The engineers knew these problems, and they were not lazy men. They kept working to fix them. They designed a special version called the T30E1. This model added an automatic system to help load the gun. The machinery would bring the breech into position, load the round, then swing the gun back to where the gunner wanted it. They even cut a new hatch into the back of the turret. Its only job was to spit out the huge empty shell casings after firing, so they would not pile up inside and choke the crew. In later tests, with all this machinery working, the gun could fire far faster than a crew loading by hand alone. It was clever. It was inventive. It was the kind of problem-solving that American factories did so well. But all of it took time, and time was the one thing this tank did not have. There was another part of the T30 that deserves attention, even though it sat hidden in the back. That was the engine. A tank this heavy needed enormous power just to move. The engineers gave it a brand new engine built by Continental Motors. It was a big 12-cylinder machine that produced around 800 horsepower. That was enough to push more than 70 tons of steel to a top speed of about 22 miles an hour on a good road. That does not sound fast. For a machine this size, it was a real achievement. Alongside the engine sat a new kind of transmission, called a cross-drive. It made the huge tank far easier to steer and control. Remember these two parts, the engine and the transmission. They will matter later in this story, long after the tank itself is forgotten. Now, back to the race against time. The engineers pushed hard. The first T30 prototype was finished in March of 1945. It rolled off and was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground for testing at the end of that month. But look at the calendar. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. The German army was collapsing on every front. Allied tanks were already rolling deep into Germany itself. The Soviets were closing in from the east. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The Tigers and Panthers that had terrorized Normandy were now burnt-out wrecks or abandoned by roadsides, out of fuel and out of hope. The enemy the T-30 was designed to destroy was simply gone. There was still Japan. For a few months, the heavy tanks might have found a use in the Pacific, blasting fortified islands. But that hope faded too. In August of 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was finished, and the T-30 was still not ready. Not truly. Building a gun that big and making it work reliably turned out to be slow, difficult work. The prototypes were tested and improved through 1947 and into 1948. Some were shipped off to be tested in freezing weather in Canada to see how they held up in the cold. By the time the Army had real working T-30s to study, the war they were meant for had been over for 3 years. When the engineers finally fired that huge gun at Aberdeen, they were not aiming at an enemy. They were aiming at a target range. They were gathering data. The thunder of that 155mm cannon rolled across empty Maryland fields, not across a battlefield. So what did the tests actually show? They showed that the gun was as powerful as everyone had hoped. Its armor-piercing shell could punch through nearly 8 inches of solid steel plate at a range of 1,000 yards. That was more than enough to destroy any German tank ever built, from any angle. Its high explosive shell could tear a fortress apart. If the T-30 had reached Normandy in the summer of 1944, it would have changed those tank duels completely. The German crews who watched Sherman shells bounce off their armor would have faced a very different enemy. But it did not reach Normandy, and so its power became a kind of sad footnote, a magnificent answer to a question nobody was asking anymore. By the late 1940s, the American Army looked at its heavy tank projects and made a hard decision. The T-30, its brother the T-29, and their cousins were cancelled. The world had changed. The next war, if it came, would be fought under the shadow of the atomic bomb. Slow, heavy, ammunition-hungry giants no longer seemed to fit the future. The surviving T-30s were quietly retired. Today, a few of them still exist, resting in museums and on old army posts, silent and enormous. It would be easy to end the story there, as a tale of wasted effort. But that would miss the most important part, because the T-30 did not really die. Pieces of it lived on, and those pieces went on to serve for decades. Remember that engine and that transmission. The big Continental engine, first built to move this giant, became the heart of an entire family of American tanks. It powered the M46 Patton, then the M47 Patton, thousands of which served with Allied armies, including the armies of Italy and France, then the M48 Patton, which fought in Vietnam. In diesel form, that same basic engine went on to power the M60, the main American battle tank for much of the Cold War. All of it grew from the powertrain first proven in the T-30. And the giant gun was not wasted either. The lessons learned from cramming that 155mm cannon into a turret helped the next generation of designers. one of the T-30's close cousins, built on the same chassis with a different big gun, became the direct ancestor of the M103 Heavy Tank. That tank actually entered service in the 1950s, guarding Western Europe against the possibility of a Soviet armored attack. So the T-30 was late for its own war, but it quietly handed its best ideas to the tanks that came after. The dead end turned out to be a doorway. There is a lesson buried in all this steel, and it is worth saying plainly. The T-30 is a reminder that in modern war, timing can matter as much as power. The most powerful weapon in the world is useless if it arrives after the fighting stops. America won the Second World War not by building the single biggest tank, but by building good enough tanks in overwhelming numbers and getting them to the battlefield when they were needed. The Sherman was outgunned in Normandy, but it was there, in its thousands, when the T-30 was still a drawing on a table. There is something almost human in the story. A team of engineers works day and night. They solve every problem set before them. They build a machine of terrible power, and they finish just after the world has moved on. Their triumph and their disappointment are wrapped up in the same moment. Stand today in front of one of the surviving T-30s. Look up at that enormous barrel. It was built to answer the fear of every American tank crew who ever watched their shells bounce off a Tiger. It was built to make sure that never happened again, and it never fired a shot at the enemy it was born to fight. The thunder of its gun, when it finally came, echoed across an empty testing range. The enemy had already gone home. The war was already won. The biggest gun ever put on an American tank had arrived, at last, too late. But its engine would rumble on for another 40 years, hidden inside the tanks that guarded a new and uneasy peace. And in that quiet afterlife, the T-30 found the purpose that the war had denied it. Not as a weapon that won a battle, but as a workshop of ideas that shaped the machines of the age to come. Sometimes history remembers the tanks that fought. Sometimes it should also remember the ones that were ready and waiting for a call that never came.